In this lecture, we'll be looking at one of the earliest objects from ancient Egypt, the palette of Narmer. And this object is important for several reasons, one of which is that it is the earliest art object to portray a figure with identification. In other words, King Narmer appears here with hieroglyphics that identify him. Also, it is a transitional object that transitions us from the pre-dynastic period to the early dynastic period, in which we see the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. And so the imagery very much suggests a object that is commemorating the events that lead up to the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Egypt was divided geographically and politically into Upper and Lower Egypt in the pre-dynastic period. Upper Egypt, the southern upstream part of the Nile down here, was a narrow tract of grassy land that was good for hunting. Lower Egypt in the north, and the Nile runs from south to north, which is why Lower Egypt is above Upper Egypt. Lower Egypt had rich soil from the Nile Delta and was good for agriculture and herding animals. Art from the pre-dynastic period generally comes from Upper Egypt, where archaeologists found early mural paintings on the walls of tombs dating to 3500 to 3200 BCE. The palette of Narmer is the first object that attempts to tell the story of a nation that is united under one ruler, King Narmer. Egyptologists debate about what is actually depicted on the palette of Narmer. It was once thought that it represented the events leading to the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, but we now think it might be more complicated in that it really commemorates a long process of unification that might have happened over several hundred years. And King Narmer is symbolically shown as the person responsible for that unification. We'll note that it's also a double-sided object, and here I'm showing you both sides, not two different objects, but both sides. And we've seen double-sided objects before, if we think about the standard of Ur, and how two sides are interrelated and dependent on one another, and sometimes have a conceptual meaning that relates to balance and the interdependence of two sides of existence. For example, on the standard of Ur, we saw the relationship of war and peace. Here, it might suggest the Egyptians' understanding of the cosmos as needing balance between good and evil and order and chaos. It was found in 1897 in the Temple of Horus. It was found in near perfect condition. It's made out of mudstone or shale, which is a pretty hard stone. It's very heavy. It's able to be carved, but it has some heft to it. It's about 25 inches tall and dates from 3000 to 2920 BCE. We see it carved in low relief, and on the flat side, the flat back side of the stone, we see a circular depression that was meant to hold eye pigment. Eye pigment was used in ancient Egypt to prevent infection and to prevent sun glare. It also had some aesthetic meaning as well. We often think about ancient Egyptians from movies and comic books having thick black eyeliner. And this is true that it was a aesthetic choice, but it also had a functional purpose as well. This was a very large and heavy object, so it was probably not meant for everyday use, but rather had a ceremonial purpose. It might have been an offering to the gods, it might have been an object in a temple, or it might have been used for ceremonial purposes to adorn the pharaoh or statues of the gods. The scenes that we see on both sides suggest the foundations of Egypt's dynasties. We'll be looking at each side individually and describing the imagery we see. But before I do, I want you to notice the imagery that is shared by both sides. At the top of each side, we see the image of the goddess Hathor or Bat, who is represented by a cow head with these curly horns. She flanks the hieroglyphs that identify King Narmer. His hieroglyphs are a catfish and a chisel. And you can probably see it a little better on this side. Those hieroglyphs are surrounded by a palace. And so right away we see that his very name has a grand implication. We'll start with this side, which we'll call the front side. And I'm showing you a diagram that has the details colored with different colors. It was not a painted object. These colors are just to help certain details stand out as we walk through them. King Narmer is very easily identified because he's the largest figure. And of course, hieratic scale is being used to identify him as the main subject. He's larger than everyone else. He's wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, and that's this kind of bowling pin shaped crown, conical crown that we'll see over and over again in Egyptian art. He is holding a mace and is smiting an enemy who is on his knees. This has been identified as an important enemy, possibly someone from Lower Egypt, a ruler from Lower Egypt, and we have a hieroglyph that identifies him here. A official foot washer or sandal bearer is on Narmer's left. He's holding sandals, and you'll notice that Narmer himself is barefoot. And this is an important convention for a king. He is standing on holy ground, which is a privilege of only the pharaoh. Around his waist, we see a bull-tailed sash. The bull, of course, is a symbol of power and of strength and appropriate for a ruler. On the right side, we see the god Horus in falcon form. He is holding in his hand a rope that goes around the neck of a human head. You'll notice that he doesn't have the talons of a falcon, but rather a human hand. The body of that head is a papyrus plant. And the papyrus was an abundant crop of the Nile. It's a symbol of control of the Nile, but also references the importance of papyrus as a vehicle of civilization, because this is what is papyrus paper is made of, and it is what records Egyptian history and hieroglyphics. Down below, we have the bodies of two dead enemies, and we see this little symbol, which is the symbol of a walled city. So these foes might be the rulers of walled cities that have been defeated by Narmer. Let's also note that this is very organized in registers. There's a lot of order, there's a lot of static order to this object. If we flip it over and look at the back side, we see that order continued. There are 4 registers this time. And under the top register, which again is the goddess Bat or Hathor, and the hieroglyphs identifying Narmer, we still can see Narmer as the most important figure by hieratic scale. He's larger than everyone else. This time he's wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt. He's wearing the bull tail sash again, but this time he's wearing a kilt that is known as the Lower Egyptian costume. His sandal bearer or foot washer is following him again, holding his sandals. In front of him is a priest wearing leopard skin, and in front of that are 4 men carrying divine standards. They could be priests or they could be soldiers. Each standard is different, and they may represent 4 different regions of Egypt. In front of that, we see a defeated army, and they are depicted in a very orderly fashion of 5 figures in 2 rows. Each of the figures have been decapitated and castrated, and their parts have been put between their legs. You'll notice that the vantage point here is from above, so that we could see again the position of the figures, the fact that they've been decapitated, and it's very orderly. Above that is a boat that is preceded by a swallow, and we are still unsure of what exactly that means. Down below, in this register, we see that circular depression that was used for grinding the pigment for eye makeup. And so remember, this is a palette, so there would have been water or oil mixed with a ground, possibly charcoal pigment. You'll notice that it's very symmetrical, and that circle is formed by the intertwining necks of 2 feline creatures, mythological creatures. Those creatures are controlled by 2 figures standing on their tails, holding their necks with leashes. And the intertwining of the necks probably represents the unification of the 2 regions of Egypt. And the figures holding the necks represent the control of humans over nature. Down below in the lowest register, we see the image of a bull knocking down the walls of a city. As he does so, he is trampling on a defeated enemy. The bull represents the pharaoh and his power, his virility, and his strength, and we see him in the process of defeating his city, a city. In the depiction of Narmer, we see an established regal standard for depicting a king. He's strong, muscular, and barefoot. And we see even the naturalistic depiction of musculature in his legs. We see a suggestion of kneecaps, muscles in the arms. Of course, the Egyptians knew quite a bit about anatomy through the mummification process. But we're starting to see conventions and a decorum for the appropriate depiction of a king. He's also in a smiting pose that we will see over and over again for thousands of years. And it's very important now that there is permanence and an unchanging view of a ruler. And so, as I mentioned in our intro lecture, we don't see a lot of change in this figure for thousands and thousands of years. So to summarize, we start to see that in this object, we start to see the regal standard for a king. It is a commemoration of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. It is a ceremonial object that held eye makeup, and it is the first work of art in which we see a named individual.